What if the real American dream in 2026 is not living in the most famous state, but living in the state where your money still feels like money? Because that is the problem more and more people are running into now. On paper, two households can earn roughly the same income, but in one state, that income buys some breathing room. In another, it feels like a race against housing costs, taxes, utilities, and everyday bills that never stop climbing. And that is why this conversation matters. This is not really a story about being cheap. It is a story about value, about where your money still has the power to build a calmer, more manageable life. Now, before we start, I want to define the rules clearly. This is not a list of the most glamorous states, and it is not a list of the absolute cheapest rural corners of America. It is a practical shortlist of 7 states that stand out because they combine lower statewide cost of living with housing that is still relatively reachable, while also offering real places where people can imagine living day to day. To build that list, I am mainly using Merrick's 2025 Annual Cost of Living Index, Zillow's February 2026 home value data, and state tax comparisons. And one important caveat, Merrick's state index is built by averaging participating cities and metro areas in each state, so it is a strong statewide comparison tool, but not a promise that every town inside a cheap state will feel equally cheap. That warning matters because one of the biggest mistakes people make when looking at America is assuming a low-cost state automatically means an easy life everywhere inside it. It does not. A cheap state can still have overheated metros. A more expensive state can still have overlooked bargains. So the real goal of this video is not to sell a fantasy. It is to show which states still give ordinary money more room to work and which ones look cheaper than they actually feel.
The first state on the list is Oklahoma, and if you care about pure math, Oklahoma is hard to ignore. Merrick ranked Oklahoma as the lowest cost state in the country for 2025, with an overall index of 84.7. Its housing index was just 68.8, which is a huge reason it landed there. Zillow's February 2026 data put the average Oklahoma home value at $216,242, far below the U.S. average of $360,591. Tax Foundation also puts Oklahoma's effective property tax rate on owner-occupied housing at about 0.76 to 0.77%. That is not ultra-low, but once you combine it with very low home prices, the actual ownership burden still looks manageable compared with much of the country. And Oklahoma is interesting for another reason. It does not try to sell you a dream first, it sells you relief. It is not a prestige move. It is not a coastal move. It is not the kind of state people brag about when they want to sound aspirational. But that is part of its strength. When a place is not overloaded with national hype, it often keeps more of its basic affordability intact. Oklahoma City's average home value is about $203,329, which gives you a good sense of how much lower the entry point can still be in a practical mid-size market there. Oklahoma works best for people who are willing to trade brand value for budget power. The second state is Mississippi, and this is where the cost story becomes even more extreme. Merrick ranked Mississippi second in the country with an overall cost of living index of 86.0 and a housing index of 71.6. Zillow's February 2026 data shows the average Mississippi home value at just $189,895. Tax Foundation puts the state's effective property tax rate at 0.58%. In plain English, Mississippi remains one of the rare places in America where the statewide housing baseline is still dramatically below the national norm. But Mississippi is also where people need to be honest with themselves about what they are optimizing for.
If the question is purely, where can I reduce housing pressure the fastest, Mississippi deserves serious attention. If the question is, where do I get the strongest overall lifestyle, amenities, and polished metro experience, that becomes a different discussion. Jackson's average home value is only about $86,017, which shows just how low the entry point can be in some local markets. But it also reminds you that low prices alone do not tell the whole quality of life story. Mississippi is powerful when your priority is affordability first. It is weaker if you expect affordability and high-demand city energy to arrive together. The third state is Alabama, and Alabama may be one of the most underrated value states in the country. Merrick ranked it fourth at 88.1 overall, with a housing index of 71.2. Zillow's February 2026 data puts the average Alabama home value at $232,106. But what really strengthens Alabama's case is tax pressure on homeowners. Tax Foundation puts its effective property tax rate at just 0.36%, one of the lowest in the country. That matters because affordability is not only about buying the house, It is about continuing to afford the house after you get it. Alabama's quiet strength is that it often feels more livable than outsiders expect. It has warm weather, a lower-cost southern profile, and in cities like Huntsville, the housing is still much more grounded than in many higher-profile metros. Huntsville's average home value is about $283,226. Not dirt cheap, but still far below the national average and below many of the fast-growing boomtowns people chase first. Alabama is the kind of state that rarely dominates national relocation fantasies, but often looks stronger the longer you stare at the numbers. The fourth state is Arkansas, and Arkansas is one of the clearest examples of a state that stays off a lot of people's radar while quietly offering a very workable cost structure. Merrick ranked Arkansas 8th with an overall index of 90.1.
A housing index of 78.8, and a healthcare index of 87.3. Zillow's February 2026 data puts the average Arkansas home value at $219,754, and Tax Foundation places its effective property tax rate at about 0.53%. That combination matters because Arkansas is not just cheaper on one front, it is relatively manageable across housing, taxes, and healthcare costs at the same time. And that is where Arkansas is probably one of the most practical states on this list. It does not have the no income tax headline of Texas or Tennessee. It does not have the southeastern migration spotlight of South Carolina. But if your goal is to make a monthly budget feel less fragile, Arkansas has a compelling case. Little Rock's average home value is about $214,773, which is very close to the state average and reinforces the idea that this is not just a cheap-on-paper state with one impossible metro dragging everything up. Arkansas is not flashy, but it has one of the cleanest cost stories in the group. The fifth state is Tennessee, and Tennessee is where this list starts to get more complicated. On paper, Tennessee looks fantastic. MERIC ranked it at 90.1 overall, tied with Arkansas, and its healthcare index came in at 86.4. Zillow's February 2026 data puts the average Tennessee home value at $327,696. Tennessee also does not levy an individual income tax, and Tax Foundation puts its effective property tax rate at about 0.49%. Those are strong advantages, and they help explain why Tennessee remains so attractive in relocation conversations. But Tennessee is also where people can fool themselves by stopping too early. The statewide number is fine. The famous markets are another story. Nashville's average home value is about $429,861, which is well above the state average and above the national average.
Chattanooga, by contrast, sits around $314,306, which feels much more in line with the Tennessee people imagine when they hear better value. So Tennessee is not automatically cheap, it is selective. If you choose carefully, the no income tax structure and modest property tax burden can feel very attractive. If you buy into the hottest branded markets, the value story gets weaker fast. The sixth state is Texas, and Texas may be the most misunderstood state on this list. It still has a strong case. Merrick ranked Texas at 91.1 overall. Zillow's February 2026 data shows the average home value at $297,592, below the U.S. average and below Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee. Texas also has no individual income tax, which keeps it permanently attractive to people comparing big Sunbelt states. But if you stop there, you misunderstand Texas.
But the bigger reason South Carolina matters is that it does not just look cheap. It also looks like a place people actively want. The Census Bureau says South Carolina was the fastest growing state in the country from July 2024 to July 2025, with 1.5% growth driven heavily by domestic migration. That combination is powerful. A lot of low-cost states stay low-cost, partly because they never become emotionally popular. South Carolina is different. It is building real momentum while still keeping a friendlier cost structure than many of the states it competes with. But just like Tennessee, it requires skepticism at the local level. Columbia's average home value is about $226,769, which looks very manageable. Charleston, meanwhile, is about $581,145, which completely changes the affordability story. So South Carolina is not a miracle. It is a state where the right market still looks like strong value, while the hottest market starts looking like the old problem in a new place. Now, if you step back from the list, a bigger pattern starts to appear. The states where your money goes furthest are not always the states with the best marketing. In fact, often the opposite is true. When a state becomes too successful as a brand, it starts to charge you for the image. That is part of what happened to Florida. It is part of what can happen in parts of Tennessee or coastal South Carolina. The strongest value states tend to be the ones that still deliver practical living without turning every desirable metro into a national commodity. That is also why where your money goes furthest is not exactly the same as where everything is cheapest. Mississippi and Oklahoma are probably closer to the pure affordability end of the story. South Carolina and Tennessee are more about strategic compromise. Alabama and Arkansas are underrated middle ground plays. Texas is the large-scale no-income tax option with a real warning label.
In other words, this is not one list for one kind of person. It is 7 different versions of the same question. Where can an ordinary budget still buy an ordinary life without feeling constantly squeezed? If I had to simplify the list by type, it would look like this. Oklahoma is for the person who wants math first and image second. Mississippi is for the person willing to maximize affordability even if the state has less polish. Alabama is for someone who wants low ownership pressure in a warmer southern state. Arkansas is for the person who wants a balanced, underappreciated value state. Tennessee is for the person who likes the no income tax story but knows not to overpay for hype. Texas is for someone who wants size, opportunity, and zero income tax, but can live with higher property taxes. And South Carolina is for the person who wants one of the best combinations of warmth, momentum, and still reasonable costs, as long as they avoid paying coastal premium prices. And that brings us to the most important conclusion in this entire video. In 2026, money does not go furthest where headlines are loudest. It goes furthest where the relationship between housing, taxes, and everyday costs still makes ordinary life feel possible. That is the real value test now. Not whether a state is trendy, not whether it sounds impressive, not whether it has the strongest brand, but whether the check, the mortgage, the utilities, the taxes, and the grocery bill still line up in a way that leaves room to breathe. And for a lot of Americans, that kind of breathing room is becoming the most valuable thing of all.